Today I want to talk about a rather chilling notion of indefinite detention. It's one thing when we might do that to warriors on a battlefield outside of the United States. But we're talking about another kind of war that's been declared by administration officials, at least one as high as Janet Napolitano, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, saying that, among other people, essentially she was describing the Republican base, people who were against high taxes, want small government, constitutional government, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment. She said they are enemies of the state. They are police officers. Listen to Janet Napolitano. She will tell you who are the people you should be most especially concerned about. These are the potential terrorists among us. And, well, you know what we do with terrorists, right? We stick them in Gitmo and keep them there indefinitely. What if that were to happen right here in the U.S. of A. because some pointy-headed prosecutor thought that you needed to be held indefinitely? That's what we want to talk about. The book is entitled Indefinite Detention, A Crisis Brewing in America. The author of it is Danial Danz, and Daniel is with me today. Daniel, thanks so much for having put the book together and for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate talking to you about this.
So Napolitano has made it pretty clear, and I don't think that was just rhetoric that was somewhat over the top, which of course it was, but I think that sort of gave us a look at the heart of this current administration. This Alinsky administration is not playing tiddlywinks. And although the Republicans haven't gotten the memo yet, this is war. Maybe don't have a firing line that they're marching across Lexington Green, at least not yet, but they do use guns because that's what they use when they arrest people. And when they hold them indefinitely, that's pretty serious stuff. This is not something unprecedented in our country. As you point out in your book, we've done it before as much as 60-some years ago here in the U.S. of A.
That's correct, with the Japanese at the start of World War II.
Of course, we were at war with Japan, but these Japanese were people who had chosen to move to the United States because the United States was not Japan. And by the way, for a Japanese to do that is a very significant thing, really, because the Japanese are rather, well, just to put not too pretty a word on it, racist. If you ain't Japanese, you ain't. And for them to leave Japan and to settle in the United States and to have children in the United States and to marry Americans in the United States, that's a very significant fact to keep in mind. And for us to, how many did we round up and put in camps?
Approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans.
Now, I'd be willing to accept the idea that 100 of those were spies.
I would say probably right, yes.
But, you know, out of that many, and probably most of the rest of the Japanese population would have said, if they'd have known about somebody that was anti-U.S. among the Japanese population, they would have probably dropped a dime on them.
Yeah, they were proud to be here in the United States. They opened up many businesses and were servicing the population in those cities. And for the most part, they were doing a very good job. So they had the attitudes, a conservative attitude about hard work, and so they were very industrious people.
Yeah, that's a good point. They were not here to get welfare, which pretty much didn't really exist when they got here anyway. The only thing that would have attracted you to America in the 40s and the 30s was this is a place where you can probably find a job and where you'll be allowed to keep what you make. That I wish we could say that about our country today.
Yeah, it's different today by a long shot.
So they came to the States. We rounded them up, and I got a note here about Canada. Were the Canadians rounding them up too, or what was the deal with Canada?
They were rounding up people, but it wasn't the Japanese. They were rounding up some of the Europeans. the Ukrainians, I believe it was, that they were rounding up, and they rounded up about 80,000 of them, holding them in camps. And we weren't just rounding up the Japanese. We were holding the Mexicans and Germans, Italians in this country as well.
So it wasn't just that we were anti-Japanese, it was that we were sort of anti, if you ain't us, you weren't born here. And of course, that's not even a correct description, because many of these Japanese that we rounded up were born here.
Yes. They were citizens. They had been born and raised here. And what was happening, especially in California, they made it illegal for the Japanese to own businesses. So what the Japanese parents were doing was setting up corporations and assigning the ownership of the property to their children that had been born here. That way the property stayed in their family's name. The kids owned it, but the parents still managed it.
Well, that's pretty clever, and obviously that must have made some of the authorities in California go bats. It's really a dark spot on our nation's history that we wouldn't be interested in finding out who the relatively handful of Japanese might have been who were the problem, that we couldn't have trusted the rest of the Japanese population to say, look, here's a phone number, call this number if you see somebody that you're concerned about.
The government back then is doing pretty much what the government right now is doing. They had a propaganda campaign to demonize the Japanese, just like our government currently has got a propaganda program going on, demonizing Christians and pro-constitutionalists, people that believe in the Second Amendment. It's the same thing. It's just maybe different topics, but the same process.
I think you put your finger on it. From my study of history, and in particular, any time a government, a regime, decides they need an enemy in order to mobilize the population on their behalf, it's sort of the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they'll go after a minority of the population, the Jews in Germany, the Ukrainian farmers in Soviet Union, educated people with glasses in Cambodia, Christians in Uganda under Idi Amin. And so they target that group. Everybody's afraid of, those Christians, those educated people, those farmers, whatever. And so they will rally around the government because they identify the government with the country, with us. And then they're quite okay with rounding up whatever that target population is. That's the seedbed of genocide. That's how it all gets started. And once you have that hated group and you start rounding them up, hey, who gives a rip about them being put out of their misery and put into a concentration camp and murdered? They're the enemy, right? Daniel, have you got this up on Amazon yet, or how do people get a hold of the book?
It is on Amazon.com. They can either look up the name Indefinite Detention, A Crisis Brewing in America, or they can look up my name, Daniel, Danz, D-A-N-Z.
Excellent. I want to encourage folks to get this. Your documentation is, I was going to say either stunning or staggering. It's a bunch. But you've put most of that in the appendices in the back of the book, so it certainly is an easy read. Well, it's an easy read if you don't mind your stomach being churned with what is in there. Going back to the detention of the Japanese and some others that we conducted in our country during the Second World War, the word voluntary was used for those who were interned in these camps. They voluntarily went. Well, yeah, I guess I would volunteer too if I had a gun pointed at me.
There was a lot of resentment built up against the Japanese, and to the point where they lost their jobs and they could not get any public assistance at all. They were just shut right down. So actually being put into the camps, at least they had a place to live. They had food to provide for them, and they even had some medical care. It's not the way they wanted to live their lives, but they didn't really have much choice if they wanted to survive. How
voluntary was that? Indeed.
you do what you got to do.
Exactly. Now, one of the good things during that very bad time was what the Quakers did. I had no idea that they had stepped up to the plate.
They had done a lot to help some of the Japanese families. They either took care of the property while the Japanese families were in detention, or they helped the Japanese sell the property and then put whatever personal belongings in storage, so that at some point when they were freed again, they would be able to collect the personal belongings and start over again.
That was just an outstanding response by some of our fellow Americans, and it certainly deserves mention that there had been people that saw what was being done, the devastation that was being put upon the families of so many of the Japanese here in this country. Kudos to them.
Very admirable what they did.
We had a Detention Act of 1950 for subversives. This, I guess, is sort of a continuation of the same mindset, different enemy, but same response.
That's correct. And it was one of the worst parts about the Detention Act was the issue that you could be presumed to have committed a terrorist act or about to commit a terrorist act, and that was enough for them to arrest you and detain you.
It reminds me of a movie, which I admit I haven't seen, but I heard something about it. I'm not sure I know exactly the title of the movie, but one of the insane questions that was being asked of a suspect was, "Where were you next Thursday?" And that when you describe that Detention Act of 1950, that's what came to my mind, that somehow somebody has to prove his innocence in a yet forthcoming time in the future.
Pretty much that's what the National Defense Authorization Act for 2012 does too. They are so general and so broad about the definition of terrorism that just you and I having this conversation at some point in the future could be enough to get us thrown in indefinite detention. Well,
we've used the word terrorism enough that ought to have flagged an NSA computer program. We laugh now, but I take your point. The folks that are running our government right now, I think, have that mindset. They look at themselves at war. They look at us as the enemy. And for anybody that doesn't go along with the Obama program and don't realize how seriously they look at this matter, you're missing the point, and you'd better hopefully take another look at this. Listen to this program. Get other people to listen to the podcast when we get it up at Republic Broadcasting. And this is a program that you want to have your friends and neighbors going and listening to if they're not listening to it as we air this. But the idea that you have to prove your innocence, be it for something in the past, let alone for something in the future, that is not due process. That is not the way. I think that's one of the political distinctions or distinctives that has made America the great country that it has been. And to take that away in the name of security kind of harkens back to the advice that Ben Franklin gave some lady, that it's a republic that we've given you, ma'am, if you can keep it.
This law, the indefinite detention provision, what that speaks of to me is that the government is starting to run scared. They are afraid of the American people. They're afraid of the fact that they're waking up to what's going on. And so they have to demonize every group that they possibly can in order to get the people that have no idea what's going on to back them up. But I think the government's running scared right now is what I think it is.
That's a very reasonable supposition. The idea that Napolitano would view essentially the Republican base as an enemy of the state, and she's come pretty close to putting it just that way, that's a pretty serious concern. That it's not just that she disagrees with other people's ideas, but they're enemies of the state. That's martial law type language. That's when you've got enemies of the state operating within the boundaries of the country. That is a predicate for martial law. And I think that's the way they look at what they can be doing. Our existence is a justification for martial law if they could just get away with it.
If you look back 40, 50 years ago, there are things today to then. Back then, it was okay to be a Christian. It was okay to say the Pledge of Allegiance. It was okay to support the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That has changed so much in the past 50, 60 years. It is absolutely pathetic.
You pointed out that under FEMA, military bases here and there around the country have been converted to camps, and that people have actually taken pictures of the detainment facilities that have been erected on these camps. And as far as we know right now, nobody's populating those cages, if you will, but they're there. That our government, probably even starting with Bush, I'm not sure this is just Obama, has been setting up a series of what would be called, if it were Nazi Germany, concentration camps. My guest is Danial Danz. He's the author of the book Indefinite Detention, A Crisis Brewing in America. I would say it's brewing and it's just about ready to be drunk. We're pretty far along in this dangerous path. And one of the things that has accompanied this notion that the government needs to have detainment facilities for, some sort of a tornado that wipes out an area and we have to have a place to put people. Well, I suppose that is a reason, but as you have found, Danial Danz, that's not the main reason. It's not quite so humanitarian. The government really is looking at the people, at least those that don't vote for them, as enemies of the state. That's what these so far uninhabited camps are for. And along with this has been the militarization of routine police work. The idea that just south of me, in the county next to Fairfax County, where Gun Owners of America is located, a guy was sitting out on his porch. A SWAT team approached. He was suspected of participation in some kind of numbers racket. A felony, but not obviously a violent crime. Probably the government didn't like him doing it because they didn't like the competition with the state lottery. Anyway, one of these warrior cops had his finger on the trigger, and all of a sudden, bang! And the suspect is dead, sitting on a rocker in his front porch. That's where this notion takes us, that most of the population is an enemy of the regime and has to be dealt with as an enemy. We have to have ways of containing them in concentration camps. And already the legal system is moving us in that direction, and police work has moved away from being peace officers to paramilitary. Not a good thing.
President Obama, during his first campaign to become president, on July 2nd, 2008, out in Colorado, he made a comment during his speech, and it was at the 16-minute, 45-second mark, about creating a strong internal security force. Now, this is not a new concept. If you go back to 1961, President Kennedy signed the Arms Control and Disarmament Agreement. And in that agreement, he agreed to reduce our military capability to nothing more than an internal security force. And that's where the term internal security forces comes from. And so as we're gradually dismantling our military, President Obama sent a signal to somebody out in the audience that he was prepared to start creating this strong internal security force. And in 2011, January, he started training some 20,000 military personnel to take over, not take over, but to supplement the local police department. It's a group of people that fits between the military and local law enforcement. They're not as militarized as the United States military, but they're more militarized than the local police. And after they finish their basic military training, they then get assigned to work with the police departments around the country, start training them on the local law enforcement. And so it's a stability police force, internal security force, a rapid response force, all refers to the same group of people. And the training actually got started in January 2011.
You know, Janet Napolitano, who views us as the enemy of the regime, now has bulked up the Department of Homeland Insecurity to 100,000, give or take, sworn police agents. None of them should have that job. None of them should have a federal badge. That is totally unconstitutional. And yet these are folks with arrest powers, and as you say, they can act in a kind of a quasi-military fashion, with MRAPs, with armored vehicles, with battlefield-style weapons. These folks are there at the ready, and you wonder, what are they on the ready for? Don't we already have state and local police? What gives with 100? And that's just that one department. We're not talking about the FBI, the EPA. Department of Education sent a SWAT team out last year. Some poor gal had fallen behind in her education loans, and she looks out her window, and there's a SWAT team all around her dwelling. This is crazy. This is not America.
It's the training that these guys are getting right now, and I should say guys and gals. You can look at 29 Palms Marine Base out in California. They have actually set up a mock city about the size of downtown San Diego. It has 1,500 buildings in it, miles of roads, a man-made river in it, tunnels, fighter holes, and even some of the buildings are built so that they can actually do live fire exercises there. And the police departments, the FBI, state police, are going there for actual training and dealing with civil unrest in the city. And that's what the whole facility was built for. And so there's part of the militarization of the police departments around the country. And the MRAP that you're talking about, the mine-resistant anti-personnel vehicles, why do our local police need vehicles like that? There is absolutely no reason for it, unless they're planning on stirring up trouble, and the trouble is going to get so violent that they need vehicles like this.
If this were being set up by a sheriff's department, we would have recourse. We could say, Sheriff, you don't get what your job is. You're a peace officer. You're not a military officer. And so we're going to have to find somebody else to take your job. But it's not so easy when it's a police department, when they've been trained by the federales in these paramilitary tactics, and they think they're probably doing the right thing, that this is modern police work. No, it's modern police work if you like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and so forth. That's modern police work in that sense, but that's not the way it's supposed to be here in our country. And I think you've identified, you've spotlighted a really serious problem that we have in our country, and we're going to have to start dealing with it. You talked about photographs that people have taken of railroad cars that have been set up as prison transports. Now, let's see, where did they have that kind of transport before? Oh, yeah, I remember. That was Nazi Germany.
Well, also here in the United States with the Japanese. They had to move a large number of people real quick, and so they used railroads to transport them. Same thing in the Soviet Union during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They moved large numbers of people by train. So it's not a new concept.
It's not a new concept, and it's just really stunning to think that it's gone this far. And, of course, we can't count on the media to handle this problem, and so we've got to get the word out. And, Daniel, your book, Indefinite Detention, certainly is very important in that capacity, getting the word out. You point out that the current administration is spending hundreds of billions to train troops for civil disturbances, to train them how to confiscate guns, round up citizens, to conduct surveillance of the population. And, of course, I thought the NSA was already doing a pretty good job of that. And of course, as has been in the news a bit lately, purchasing billions of rounds of ammunition. Now, a lot of that I think you can explain in terms of they have too many police agents that they need to have target practice. But target practice with hollow point ammunition, that's expensive stuff.
Back in 1898, the Hague Convention is where this issue first came up. They agreed not to use hollow point ammunition in the war zones overseas. The United States signed off on the treaty but never ratified it, but they've always abided by it. So the 40 caliber hollow points aren't going to be used overseas. They're going to be used in the country.
Right. Those are handgun rounds. Those are very good defense rounds. Those are the kind of rounds that I own. But the idea that my government is thinking about using them at a minimum doesn't make sense.
I'm Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and I want to invite you to join the Second Amendment movement with Gun Owners of America, the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. Take action by becoming a GOA member today by going to gunowners.org. Gun Owners members receive the GOA newsletter, fact sheets, alerts, certificates, and more. But there's more to joining GOA than just a list of member benefits. The united voice of GOA members has been successful in defeating restrictive legislation designed to disarm our population. GOA has helped to get strong constitutional members of Congress like Senator Ted Cruz elected. And with your help, GOA will continue to successfully defend the rights of gun owners in the courts. Participate in our efforts to restore and preserve the nation's right to keep and bear arms. All contributions to our lobbying efforts are used exclusively to support or oppose firearms legislation. Join online at gunowners.org.
We are looking at how the federal government primarily, although it's not limited just to what the federal government is doing. They encourage states to be as bad as they are. But one of the things that, Daniel, you point out in the book, that there's a government job description, actually for the Army. They have, at least at one time, sought to hire people to work for, quote, internment resettlement specialists. Whoa!
They're asking people, the National Guard put out the ad, and I believe the Army did too, looking for people that wanted to work in a prison environment with the purpose of controlling the general population here in this country. It's not, they weren't hired to go overseas and work in detention camps. They were hired to work here. And they have been training them in the prison environment. Now, we were talking about some of the exercises that have been conducted around the country in the past few years. Back in the mid-1990s, they realized that the war in the future is going to be fought in the cities. And so they have been training our troops, plus the Russians, the Germans, the Chinese, etc., to work with our troops and to detain people, to confiscate guns, to round people up, to put down riots, civil unrest. And the training is for this country here, although I'm sure that the spinoff is that these foreign troops can take their training to their respective country. But these kind of exercises have been going on for about 15 years now.
And the idea that we would be training this kind of training with Russians and Chinese, people who really don't have our best interests at heart, that tells me that there's a one-world mentality in echelons of our military and our government that's pretty well developed. They don't apparently talk much about it, but the fact that, well, in fact, you cite one example where in a joint training exercise with the Russians, you found that the Russians were better informed about the exercise than the local sheriff.
Yes, they try to keep that kind of information restricted to a certain degree, but they're also training these troops to take over local government in case of a crisis of some sort, whether it's a manufactured crisis or like a Katrina-type crisis. But they are training them to take over the local government. And the sad thing is, in some of these military exercises they're conducting here in this country, they are using the children in the community to act as spies for them. The kids go out into the neighborhood, talk to this person, that person, find out who's got guns, who's doing this, who's doing that, and then the kids are rewarded with candy or movie tickets or whatever. You turn that information over to the military that's conducting the exercise. The kids.
Yeah, that's the stuff right out of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and Castro's Cuba to this day. That's the way they use kids. In fact, it's been going on among some medical circles. The pediatricians are the worst. They encourage their members of the American Pediatric Association to ask such questions as, little 5-year-old Johnny, does your daddy have guns in the house? That ought to get that doctor reported to the ethics board of his professional association. That is not a medical question. That is a question for a dictatorship.
That's right. That's right. And the thing is, our younger generations have been dumbed down so much that they go along without a whole lot of questions asked because they don't know any better.
Right. And there's somebody in authority. He's standing there with his priestly white smock on, and so he's obviously different and evidently above mommy and daddy. And so, yeah, if he wants to know, then I should tell him, right? Especially if mommy or daddy is not in the room, which is generally the way they try to pull that off. We found in studies that had been done, I guess going back as far as the war between the states up through the Korean War, that there were many soldiers that died either with a gun in their holster or a rifle in their hands with unspent ammunition, never having fired a shot, even though the enemy soldier had obviously been in a line of fire with the deceased soldier. There's a normal reluctance that God has built into most people to keep us, to make us reluctant to take another life, and we'll only do it under an extreme circumstance. And so the military, realizing that, began to train soldiers to just shoot. See target, shoot. See target, shoot. See target, shoot. Well, now you found that they are training soldiers not just that way, and I'm in with that. That's fine, because I don't want our soldiers dying because they're having a debate over whether or not they ought to be taking another person's life. But to shoot a pregnant woman?
Yes, the company, I got to remember what the name of it is. The initials I had were, I think, were LET.
Somewhere up in Minnesota.
Yes, yes. They created a series of targets that were very personalized. A woman at a playground with her child holding a gun. Grandma and grandpa holding a shotgun. A pregnant woman holding a gun. And these targets were meant for the specific purpose of desensitizing law enforcement, so that when they got into a situation, they just reacted. They didn't think, they just reacted because they were used to shooting at targets of a pregnant woman or a woman holding a child. And if you think about some of the news articles we're hearing today, where people are getting shot, like the person sitting on the porch there, they just shot him, becoming desensitized and more willing to just react to the situation as opposed to think about the situation. Now, granted, I understand that the law enforcement, when they're under certain circumstances, their lives are in danger, and they have to be able to react quickly. But I think this crosses the line in regards to training them to do their job.
Frankly, I think law enforcement has a tougher job than a soldier. The soldier's purpose is to kill and destroy. A sheriff's job is to apprehend and bring in for process, for a trial, bring a live prisoner into the courtroom. So I think you're right. That's a dangerous job. And in some ways, I really think it's more dangerous than a soldier on a battlefield, because he knows, well, except under Zero's rules of engagement, where you can't shoot at anybody until they've shot at you first. But normally, a soldier's job is a little bit easier because he shouldn't have the same restraints that a cop does. The problem that you've identified is that We have been in a state of emergency since FDR. Every president has found an excuse to renew a state of emergency, which means that they can, if they so declare, suspend habeas corpus. They can suspend due process. That puts the American people clearly in the posture of enemy combatants. We hear the left and the president, before he was elected, caterwauling about the indefinite detention of actual terrorists down in Guantanamo. We have set the stage for making the whole United States a Guantanamo. Danial, Danz, I want to thank you so much for having put together this really impressive bit of research. Indefinite detention, a crisis brewing in America.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns, and that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.